Have you ever wondered why you don't need to think about stuff like making your heart beat or bringing air into your lungs? This is due to the neuromuscular system and how the brain talks to muscles through a set of nerve cells. In today's lesson, we're going to be learning more specifically about the role of these autonomic nervous system functions and the different types of muscle fibers, as well as how the brain can increase the strength of muscular contractions. Now, if we start by focusing on the autonomic nervous system, the prefix auto means self. This means that anything that is controlled by the autonomic nervous system is stuff that we don't have to think about. So if we use this example of Ronaldo jumping to win a header, what kind of things is he not having to think about? He's not having to tell his heart how to beat or how fast to beat. He's probably also not thinking about bringing air into his lungs, not thinking about plantar flexing his ankles in order to jump higher. This is because of something known as the autonomic nervous system, and it works involuntarily. That means you don't control when it works. And there are loads of parts of the body that do this. In fact, if you look at the icons in blue and red, you might even be able to work out what functions the autonomic nervous system carries out for you without your conscious control. And by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain which of these functions happen as part of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is about rest and digest, and the sympathetic nervous system, which is about fight or flight. Now, if we focus first on the rest and digest system, which is the parasympathetic nervous system, you might have noticed that the things in blue relate to our parasympathetic nervous system. For example, they're going to bring our breathing rate down, it's going to bring our heart rate down, it's going to allow us to rest more effectively, and the stomach or the digestive system are going to be more active. It's also interesting that our reproductive system are obviously going to be more active when the parasympathetic nervous system has us feeling well rested. In comparison, if we talk about the sympathetic nervous system or our fight or flight system, when we get into situations where our adrenaline's pumping, we're going to see our pupils dilate, our heart rate and breathing rate is going to be increased, whilst our digestive and reproductive systems are going to be inhibited. So the brain is diverting blood away from areas that don't need it and towards areas that do need it. One of the areas that do need it are the working muscles. And we have different types of muscle fibers. So when we have a bundle of muscle cells that form a muscle fiber, these can either be fast twitch, when there are two types, if you remember from GCSE PE, or slow twitch, which is our type 1 muscle fibers, which are better designed for longer distance aerobic type tasks. Now, if you look at these muscle fibers underneath the microscope, you might even be able to work out which one is which just from the photos. Now, if I told you that the darker red colour represents the difference in oxygen supply, this should make it even more obvious. We have our two different types of fast twitch muscle fibers on the right hand side, and we obviously have our slower twitch type 1 muscle fibers on the left hand side. So our type 1 muscle fibers are predominantly aerobic in nature, which means they're better suited for longer duration, low force tasks like marathon running, whilst our fast twitch muscle fibers are more suited for explosive tasks. But how do they differ in their properties? The first one is the contraction speed, or the speed at which they can get the muscle fiber to contract. So it makes sense that our type 2A and type 2B muscle fibers, which are our fast twitch muscle fibers, ideally we're going to need the contraction speed to be much quicker. Because they contract much more quickly, it also means that they're going to fatigue much more quickly. So just as an overview, we have our type 1 muscle fibers, which are suitable for long, slow distance endurance events like marathon running. And then we have our fast twitch muscle fibers, which can be separated into two different groups. You have your type 2B, or these are sometimes referred to as type 2X, which are our most explosive muscle fibers. So they're going to be involved in the highest force activities like sprinting or lifting a maximally heavy weight. And we have our type 2A muscle fibers, which are kind of like a middle ground between the two, but they are for middle distance running, still reasonably explosive, but not near maximal intensity. Now, the motor neuron size. The motor neurons are nerve cells which transmit the brain's instruction as electrical impulses to muscles. The bigger this motor neuron is, the faster it's going to send electrical impulses to the muscles. Now, if we think about our most explosive muscle fibers, we're going to want, for example, to be able to sprint away from a tiger from an evolutionary perspective. So we need that motor neuron size to be bigger so it can take the electrical impulses or the instructions to the muscles much more quickly. In comparison, the type 1 muscle fibers not only is their conduction speed slower, but the motor neuron conduction capacity, so their ability to carry nerve impulses, is going to be much slower. Now, the higher the motor neuron conduction capacity, the quicker the signal is going to get sent to the muscle. So as I said in my previous example, if you wanted to up and sprint away from a tiger, you need that neuron to send the message to the muscle cell as quickly as possible. Now, the obvious difference is the force production. Now, high force activities are going to require higher force motor units. So the motor unit is the muscle fiber and the motor neuron that feeds the muscle fiber electrical information. So more force can be produced from the type 2X or the type 2B muscle fibers than the type 1 muscle fibers. Remember, our high force activities such as sprinting or lifting a maximally heavy weight are going to require our muscle fibers with the highest generating force. Now, because type 2B muscle fibers have the ability to produce the highest amount of force, this also means that they work for quite short durations because they fatigue very, very quickly. One of the reasons that they fatigue very, very quickly is they work anaerobically, so they don't have a good oxygen supply. In comparison, the type 1 muscle twitch fibers, which are low force, also means that because they only produce a low amount of force, it means they can carry on providing energy to the muscle, or they can carry on working for a much longer period of time. So because of this, they fatigue at a much slower rate. Another reason why type 1 muscle fibers have a high resistance to fatigue has to do with the powerhouse of the cell, the mitochondria. So the mitochondrial density, or how much mitochondria is packed into the muscle cell, is much higher for type 1 muscle fibers compared to type 2B muscle fibers. So since the mitochondria is where oxygen is used to create ATP, or energy for the cell, we know that the aerobic system, or the type 1 muscle fibers, are going to produce more ATP or more energy for the muscle. So the more energy that gets, the more mitochondria there is, the more aerobic respiration that takes place, the more ATP or energy that gets produced by that muscle fiber. But mitochondrial density isn't the only reason that type 1 muscle fibers have a higher resistance to fatigue. It also has to do with the type of blood vessel that is the smallest kind and helps us exchange oxygen, nutrients, and waste products between the blood and the muscle cells. If you've worked it out, it's the capillary. And from previous lessons on blood redistribution, you should also know the function that capillaries have in order to restrict blood flow. I'm talking about the precapillary sphincter, which can help constrict capillaries to restrict blood flow, and when they relax, they're going to increase blood flow. So because there's a greater capillary density in type 1 muscle fibers, this means that not only is it easier to supply oxygenated blood to the muscle, but it also means because of the mitochondrial density of the type 1 muscle fibers, there's also a much greater aerobic capacity, or the ability to do aerobic work, from the type 1 muscle fibers. Now we understand the structure, or the physical makeup of type 1 muscle fibers, it becomes easy to understand why they're best suited for aerobic activity. And it also helps explain why, in comparison, the type 2B muscle fibers have characteristics that make them really good at explosive activities. So let's dig a little bit deeper into that. The type 2B muscle fibers have a enzyme called myosin ATPase. Anytime you see the letters ASE, that represents an enzyme, and an enzyme is designed to break something down in order to speed up a chemical reaction. In this case, myosin's a protein that converts chemical energy in the form of ATP to mechanical energy. So when myosin converts this chemical energy, into mechanical energy, this means it generates force and movement. Now, because the force produced, or the movement produced by type 2b muscle fibers, is very quick and explosive, it makes sense that you're going to get more of this enzyme that helps convert chemical energy into movement. So the fastest breakdown of ATP is going to occur in activities that are explosive because of this reason. So type 2b muscle fibers have a very high content of myosin ATPase, whereas in comparison, type 1 muscle fibers have a very low amount of this enzyme. Now, because type 1 muscle fibers work aerobically, it also means that they have to work for longer periods of time. So if they've got to work for longer periods of time, the same way that if you had to run for a longer duration of time, you would run at a much slower speed. So the relationship between muscle fiber type and contraction speed is that type 1 muscle fibers have a lower contraction speed because they are more resistant to fatigue and because they need to work for longer durations of time. This is why marathon running is typically one of the activities where we use type 1 muscle fibers. So we have two types of characteristics. We have functional characteristics, which is what the fiber does, and structural characteristics, which is the physical makeup of the fiber. So if you had a question like, explain how the structure of type 1 muscle fibers support its function, the first thing you might mention is what the function is. So they work aerobically or in the presence of oxygen. This would get us 1 mark. You'd also might want to mention in terms of a structural characteristic that they're smaller in size in comparison to the fast twitch muscle fibers. Now, because they're smaller than the type 2b and type 2a muscle fibers, this means they're going to contract less powerfully and a lot more slowly. And this also means that because they're contracting more slowly and less powerfully, they're going to fatigue at a much slower rate. This is what makes it designed for its function. You could also say that type 1 muscle fibers have high mitochondrial density, which means that type 1 muscle fibers fatigue more slowly. So I've made a clear link between the structure and the function. Or you could say they have a high capillary density, so the ability at which oxygen can be supplied to type 1 muscle fibers is a lot greater. And finally, I might put a third and final point that then references the fact that this is what makes them so good for longer duration activities such as marathon running. Now, if we look at type 2b or type 2x muscle fibers, they're the same thing. We should be able to look at the picture on the right and work out that they have a much lower oxygen supply in comparison to type 1 muscle fibers. But what is it that differentiates the properties of muscle fibers? And more specifically, what is a motor unit? So we know a muscle fiber is part of a motor unit, but the other thing that's part of a motor unit is something called a motor neuron. Remember, neuro relates to nerve cells, motor relates to movement. So these motor neurons are what carry the electrical messages or impulses to the muscle to make them contract. So we know we've got a motor unit that comprises of a motor neuron, which transmits electrical impulses down the axon of the motor neuron, which is the yellow thing you can see on your screen, to the muscle fiber itself. There is a neuromuscular junction that is in the branches of the motor neuron and connects the motor neuron to the muscle fiber. We'll learn more about that in a separate lesson, but it's important that you know the connecting neuromuscular junction. Now, we have two different types of muscle movement. We have what's called fine motor control, which is typically smaller muscles, and we have gross motor control, which is larger muscles like the quadriceps in the legs. And another thing that's important for you to know is the all or none law. So the all or none law basically states that it's not possible for a motor unit to partially contract. It either contracts or it doesn't. And what allows it to contract or not contract is the strength of the impulses sent to the muscle via the nerve cell. So the all or none law is once the motor neuron stimulates the muscle fibers, either they all contract or none of them do. We don't have partial contraction of muscle fibers. So if the strength of the electrical impulses is above a given threshold, then a contraction is initiated. If it's not, then none of the fibres in the motor unit contract. So this again is our all or none law. Either all of the fibres in the motor unit contract because it's above the threshold, or none of them contract because it isn't. So let's wind back a little bit. All of the fibres of a motor unit have the same muscle fibres in them. So for example, they'll either be all slow twitch, all type 2A, or all type 2B. We can't have a mixture of fibres within a unit. And we know that the brain is going to help us recruit this collection of motor units and muscle fibres depending on the intensity of the activity. For example, if it's a low intensity, the brain will recruit slow twitch fibres, and if it's of the highest intensity, it will be type 2B muscle fibres, and if it's a near maximal intensity but not quite maximal, it will recruit type 2A muscle fibres. So if the brain decides to recruit slow twitch muscle fibres, this means the activity is of submaximal long duration, such as marathon running. If it is an explosive activity, such as sprinting, then we know the brain is going to recruit type 2B muscle fibres because these are the most explosive. But how do we increase the strength of a muscle contraction? If an activity means we need more than a single twitch, what happens then? A way I like to think about this is, imagine you have a team of security guards. How would you increase the strength of that team? Well, firstly, you'd recruit more of them. And this is exactly what the brain does when it comes to motor units. So motor unit recruitment is the activation of additional motor units to accomplish an increase in contractile strength in a muscle. So in short term, or in other words, the brain recruits more motor units for high force activities so that it can create a condition where there is greater contractile strength in the muscle. Now, besides the number of motor units recruited, if we go back to our security guard analogy, how else could we increase the size of contraction? Now, this should be a hint, or hopefully this hint works as well in reality as it did in my brain. But not only have we got more security guards, but you should also notice that we've increased the size of them. Now, when the strength of a contraction changes by altering both the number and the size of the muscle's motor units, this is known as spatial summation. And spatial summation is one of the ways that we can increase the strength of the contraction in a muscle. But there is another way. So we mentioned that a muscle twitch is a single quick contraction followed immediately by relaxation. Now, at this level, you don't need to know the names of the different periods within a muscle twitch, but you do need to know, as you can see from the diagram, that a muscle twitch is a single quick contraction. So you can see that tension increases and then it's followed by a relaxation. But what happens if we need more than this single quick contraction? This is where wave summation comes in. So wave summation is where there's a repeated nerve impulse with no time to relax. So when I say no time to relax, what I mean is there's no time for it to fully relax. So you'll notice that since there's no time for it to relax completely, you'll see that a smooth, sustained contraction occurs. So our two ways of increasing the size of muscular contraction are spatial summation, where the size and number of the motor units involved are increasing, and wave summation, where we get repeated nerve impulses with no time to relax. And this is what results in a smooth, sustained contraction. So you'll notice the difference between a twitch, which is a singular muscular contraction followed by an immediate relaxation, and a wave summation where there is more force produced because there is repeated not only repeated stimuli, but repeated muscular contractions. Now, at this point, you should be able to explain the structural and functional characteristics of all three different types of muscle fibers. You might need to whiz back through the video in order to look more closely at type 2A muscle fibers. You should also know how motor units are involved in the process of spatial summation, and how the brain or the body uses wave summation as a way of increasing the strength of contractions. If you have any comments, then drop me a message in the comment section, but otherwise I'll catch you in the next video.